The next presentation is, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. And he's also quite a titan of industry and has a great perspective in from Washington, D.C., actually Florida, I think is where he is living currently, but had a role at PwC overlooking a tremendous amount of transactional activity, I think head of M&A and technology. And Digital Global Systems was a company that I learned about from Jinan Glasgow George. Many of you know Jinan. If you're looking for a good patent IP lawyer, she's based in Raleigh, North Carolina. She's also quite an important technology investor. And she has a conference every year in October in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was speaking glowingly about Fernando, so asked for an introduction and so forth. Pretty much all of you in the room understand what 5G services is. And Fernando's got a fantastic way of communicating to make it accessible. But he mentioned to me at one point, in the same way that Apple controls the App Store, Digital Global Systems will control the rollout of 5G services. And I wanted him to speak today, first of all, today focusing on Digital Global Systems, because there's a fascinating shift in an industry that I think you'll all be very interested because it affects so much of our lives. And then Fernando has very graciously offered to come back tomorrow and to give a kind of masterclass in terms of how to raise capital and access, having done so much raising of capital. So we look forward to that tomorrow. But I'd love if you would please welcome Fernando Murias to the stage.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks for having me here and opening your home last night. The cocktail party was excellent, and most importantly, for inviting my wife to join today so that she's not shopping and saved me about $10,000 as a result of that invite. So thank you. I don't know how many of you are familiar with spectrum and some of the terminology. I'll try to keep this presentation not too technical, but when we talk about spectrum, what we really are talking about is the airwaves in which signals travel, right? So it's our communication signals, it's our data, et cetera. And when we talk about RF, it's radio frequencies, right? And so you'll hear some of that terminology today. And one of the most important shifts that we're seeing now is the fact that spectrum is finite. And so a country's resource, one of their biggest assets is spectrum, how to optimize the use of that spectrum and balance it between the security that the military needs to focus on, as well as the commercial aspects of monetizing spectrum are very important balance. And one of the things that we're seeing now, as Julie mentioned, with finally the rollout of 5G and impending rollout of 6G, we are expecting a very significant shift towards a service digital economy as opposed to volume. So in the past, where you've seen a real focus on just managing the sheer volume and capacity of new devices, new protocols, et cetera, you're going to start to see a real shift towards a focus on services. And that's going to change the infrastructure that supports this underlying communication system pretty drastically. And in order to do that, you have to have technology that can, in real time, assess what's happening in the RF environment, in the spectrum, to provide actionable information that you can actually use in delivering the services for your business, right? So we formed Digital Global Systems about 10 years ago. Our focus was just that, to understand how to create technology that autonomously could support what we felt was going to be a significantly exploding digital economy around telco and data growth. We have spent the last 10 years building technology and a patent portfolio through Janan's help. We've got 160 issued patents. We've got 39 pending patents. And I spent most of my career in technology at PwC prior to becoming the CEO of DGS. And I can tell you there's a whole argument we could have around what's the value of patents and are they worth it? It really depends on the sector that you're in and what you're doing. But in this particular case, when you're a startup company and you're innovating, and so you are trying to get a market to shift into a direction, typically what happens is revenues are slower in coming. So you have to have protected IP that you can show value with to investors. and also make sure that you're respected from the larger players, that you're going to ultimately encroach on part of their market share. So we believed and still do that IP is a critical element for this particular sector, which is why we've had such a big focus on it.
I have a good question. So
Yes.
Of the patents, how large percentage of the scientists and engineers are come up with the real patentable knowledge? Is it 80-20 rule there too, or what?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say to you that the way we do patents at DGS is my CTO, who sits on a significant number of relevant government committees that are showing us trends that are coming in the industry and allow us to kind of see into the future a little bit better than some small companies because of that access. So having your pulse on what's coming is an important aspect, so you can, what I call, shoot ahead of the duck, so you actually hit the duck when it comes, right? So, but our CTO and his foresight on the industry, who I believe is one of the best RF engineers in the country, is an important element. Then taking that knowledge and creating a product from it is a team of mid-engineers underneath him that really make that happen. And then the third leg of the stool is understanding how to monetize that idea with the right markets and understanding which markets are ripe for that revenue. So when we look at and develop a portfolio of pending patents, we look at what's the next market sector that can impact our business model, and what's the niche that we can try to grab inside that sector to make a difference. And so a lot of people believe that you have to be a very large company to impact change. And I can tell you that hasn't been my experience personally. Thank you. My experience while at PwC, where I was overseeing M&A in the Washington region, and had a lot of experience in the high tech sector when I was running it for the East Coast for PwC. I saw so many companies with significantly brilliant technology, but they couldn't overcome the inertia of change that was required to monetize that technology and make it happen. So having the right combination of thought leadership, both on the technology side from a patent application, but also on the business side on how to monetize that IP, we think is critically important. So, I would tell you that, we're not a big company. We're probably 45 people in total. We have mostly engineers, software developers. I despise hardware personally. I'm a software. I like software. I like licensing. It's just a lot cleaner to implement. But we put probably 80% of the company's resources into engineering, and that's where I think the real value comes from.
Do you outsource, or
We do.
everything is insourced, or
We outsource things that we believe we leverage our clients' distribution network. We outsource our manufacturing, and outsource some software development as well. But the real brains around the strategic direction of the company is in a small handful of people in the company. Yeah. And so, with that, just to kind of continue with that theme, when we look at what are the market trends and challenges that are facing our particular market around communications, and what's the impact that our technologies had, when you look at the 5G services that I mentioned are coming, the important aspects of the services that are coming are that they need ultra low latency, in other words, very fast speeds, and highly reliable. You don't want to be driving down a highway at 60 miles an hour and have a glitch in the performance of your system, right? And so we're doing heart surgery remotely and have something happen with the connection. So the ultra reliability and the low latency is a critical aspect of the new services that are coming. Our technology, and this is why we say we're critical to the rollout of 5G services. Since we're assessing the RF environment in a particular market, in order to determine if a service that requires these features can effectively be rolled out in that market, you have to understand the environmental RF situation, and is there interference? Can it function effectively? And without technology like ours, you really don't have the underlying infrastructure to roll out those services. And so RF awareness in real time, in an automated fashion, we think is going to be a critical aspect of the new digital economy, which is the cornerstone of the patents that we have. When you look at private wireless was born because 5G was slow to roll out. And a number of other reasons. But one of the problems with 5G today is that they use a static propagation model to allocate spectrum to users. And it's very ineffective. It makes it difficult to scale the more users you have. And so one of the reasons that private wireless hasn't taken off is a very ineffective allocation methodology for its users of spectrum, right? Our technology has a much more efficient way of allocating based on real-time environmental information, not based on a static propagation model that we believe is going to change pretty dramatically over time. And so being able to address the scalability challenge that private wireless has is a big market, for us as well in our technology. And then the other important point that I'll make around what's coming and has already shifted pretty dramatically in the US is the concept of spectrum sharing. So historically, for the last 50 years, when government has repurposed spectrum for commercial use, they put it out for bid and they repurpose the spectrum for use commercially by the highest bidder of the auction. Well, in the US, the government has studied this for years and has basically said it's too costly for us to vacate the spectrum. So future repurposing of spectrum will require a technology that allows us to share that spectrum with commercial enterprises. Now, I don't know if you're following this particular area. There's been a lot of articles about this recently. This process and this analysis has been going on for years in the United States. All the carriers are against spectrum sharing, and I'll talk about why in a minute. And some of the hyperscalers are very much for it, and I'll explain that as well. And so the government, after studying this for 3 or 4 years through several committees, concluded that it was the way forward in the United States to share spectrum for future auctions. It just came out. The Biden administration just put out an announcement in December that that's their new policy. This is something being watched very closely by India and China and other major wireless markets around the world, because every government in the world is facing the issue of finite spectrum and how to optimize it, right?
Was there political consensus, or was it fighting one side against the other? Or
there was a multi-year committee process where people voiced their opinions, and then there was a series of 2-star general, 3-star general, 4-star general committees with outside consultants, of which our CTO was part of the outside consulting group, that made recommendations to the government that landed on their final conclusion to share spectrum as the optimal way going forward, right? But this is critical because we are actually one of the only companies in the world today that has technology that actually works to share spectrum. And so it's put us in a very unique position with respect to different market trends that are affecting all the rollout of these new services and the relating infrastructure that I'm talking about. The RAN infrastructure, without getting into a lot of detail, but the entire RAN market is going to shift from one of capacity and volume to one of providing services. And so the RAN can't do that without technology like ours that enables it to understand what's happening in the RF environment. And so you're going to see significant shifts, not just in services, but in the underlying infrastructure that affects our daily lives. The things that I'm talking about here, we had access to some very significant committees in the United States that were analyzing all of these things at a very high level, getting input from the largest marquee brands in the world, as well as the carriers. And so we had a seat at the party where we could really understand what was happening, where companies were, et cetera, to really benchmark our own development issues. One of the main challenges that the carriers and the people that were against spectrum sharing is that it was going to take too long. It was going to take 7 to 9 years to develop this type of technology, and it was very difficult to do. In fact, we agree it takes about 7 to 9 years. It took us 9 years to build it. We spent $90 million developing this technology over a 9-year period. We conducted over 100 proof of concepts across multiple industries in the US and in EMEA to prove out this technology with marquee global clients, which frankly is a critical aspect we can talk about on Friday with respect to if you're an innovative small company. These types of proof of concepts are critical to gain credibility in the market. And if you pick the right marquee brand, that helps a lot as well, right? It's not just what's your revenue, right? What's your revenue is not really the right question for a startup company. What's your business impact? What's your potential? And prove to me it's not just a PowerPoint and a lot of words, that you actually are able to make it work, right? And so, and then architecting, as I mentioned before, a group of patents around that technology, that position that shows your value. Our key premises that we saw coming and that we built our technology around is that broad-based environmental scanning was going to be required to manage spectrum effectively. So not narrowband, broadband, what's happening in the environment with respect to the broadband communication sectors and the frequencies. Making sure that you're processing data and signals at the edge, at the point of intercept, right? So you have real-time actionable information. Our technology platform is built on the premise that you have a set of goals as a customer that you want answers to, and we provide those answers in real time. You don't have to be an engineer to understand what's happening. We assess, we process the data, and we give you actionable information on what's happening in the spectrum against your goals. And being able to do that in an automated fashion, processing thousands of signals, in seconds, is critical to the new economy and what we're dealing with. And then, as I mentioned earlier, and Ryan and I were talking about this before we started, we have used machine learning and AI embedded throughout everything that we've developed. So we felt that AI was going to be a significant part of the new world. We started looking at this 7 years ago, and we've embedded machine learning in how we process signals, how we determine signal characteristics in a particular environment, how we locate signals. We use machine learning and AI embedded throughout everything that we do. I mentioned earlier the importance of working with customers in a particular market, and the importance of gauging, finding out who your sages are in your particular sector, leveraging that brand, not just to leverage their distribution, not just to leverage their capital and resources, but to leverage their brand. So we set out and we started looking at public safety, government, critical asset protection opportunities. Years ago, drones was really a big deal, and how drones were impacting the market. We had technology that could identify drones faster and further away than any other company at the time. And so we started looking at, okay, let's get something people really understand around critical asset protection. Let's look at border security for governments. Let's look at public safety, where first responders can't communicate when there's a natural disaster. And how can we effectuate that by understanding the RF environment in real time? And we built a business around that and started working with companies that we felt were leaders in that industry to gain market share and market traction. We also then moved to towers and rooftops and private wireless. Private wireless. Public wireless is kind of the end game. It's where the real money is globally, but it's also hard to start there. It's very political. It's very difficult to crack. So getting technology built into the infrastructure that they're using through towers was a big bet of ours, right? And so we worked with Crown Castle. We worked with Oceaneering and a number of other companies that had BNSF Railroad, which was a leader in the rail industry, to really help them understand how they could create smart towers, how they could get more out of their existing network by understanding the spectrum. So starting there and then moving into the whole private wireless world and the RAN providers and how we could make RANs more effective and more efficient and differentiated from their competitors has been a big focus of ours for the last few years. Ultimately, we see the public wireless sector being dragged into what we're selling by just competitive forces, not because they want it, because they're going to need it to survive, right? And so we see T-Mobile as probably the leader in innovation in the 5G area, the use of spectrum sharing, and probably the most innovative culture of the carriers. At least that's what we're seeing in the U.S. And as a result of that, we've been working and are leading discussions with them around how they can use our technology. And we just started a detailed discussion with them as well. Yet there's some other firms like AT&T that have this not invented here mentality, which is what you get with a lot of large companies. And you just have to plow through that, right? You just have to, put your ego to the side and really just work with them to help them see if they don't do it, they're going to be left behind because their competitors are doing it.
Do you work with Verizon?
We do. We had some very interesting discussions with both Verizon and Sprint around border. Because when spectrum was allocated near the border, a lot of the spectrum that they received was dirty spectrum. And so they used our technology to clean up the spectrum that was allocated to them for border purposes. And I would put the order, if I was asked at a cocktail party, how would you rate them innovation-wise? I would say T-Mobile, Verizon, and then AT&T. Just as far as cultural fit, if you would.
Because, the chairman of Verizon came from Ericsson, and he's a 25-year-old friend, so if you need to...
Excellent. Good to know. Thank you.
And the T-Mobile CTO is also ex-CTO of Ericsson, so...
Interesting. Yes, thank you. Yeah, the former CTO of T-Mobile, Cole Brodman, is actually on my advisory board, and it's been very helpful in shaping some of the technology direction that we're going in. My initial board was made up of finance people to help me find capital sources, and then we shifted a few years ago to really be more, as we shift from an R&D company to commercialization, to have more expertise in telco to really help drive the direction. And so I started bringing on the former CTO of T-Mobile, former CTO of Cricket Wireless, and others to help with that direction. Yep. So when someone asks me, what do you guys do? And this is like the 30-second elevator speech, right? We try to simplify our message. We're not a signals analysis company, because that means something different when you're in the government space. You're a SIGINT company. You're looking at very specific aspects of a signal for different military reasons. We are a company that assesses the RF environment in real time in an automated fashion with a goal towards what? Facilitating new 5G services. I mentioned earlier, in order to really roll out some of the services that we see coming, whether it's logistics, whether it's virtual training, virtual healthcare, all of the things that the promise of 5G and 6G is bringing, we enable those services by providing real-time understanding of the RF environment so it can be supported. The second thing that I mentioned earlier is we enable dynamic spectrum sharing, which is, I think, again, critical to optimize spectrum for any country, right? I mentioned we improve private wireless performance by moving away from static propagation models to, again, helping them understand what's in the RF environment so they can allocate spectrum more efficiently to their private wireless customers. And then last, which I've just touched on but not really discussed too much, is we enable the next generation RAN. Now, what do I mean by that, right? So again, RAN in the past, the radio access networks that are what allows you to communicate on towers, et cetera, the current infrastructure, has been historically focused on volume. How much volume can we put through in a particular tower, market, et cetera? It's shifting to how many disparate services can coexist in a particular environment. That's where this is shifting. And so technology that we put on an accelerator chipset into the RAN will shift that RAN to enable that functionality, which is, we believe, going to be a critical differentiator for firms like Nokia, Ericsson, and others to have a RAN that can enable this type of thing. We have a very different methodology than Ericsson right now. Ericsson is probably the closest one to us around spectrum sharing. But our spectrum sharing analyzes 5 different dimensions of a signal, not just power, but also signal characteristics and spatial characteristics, whereas Ericsson looks at, say, 2 or 3 characteristics of a signal. We look at 5. And so we have a much more robust system for determining how to effectively allocate spectrum. And again, we think that's a cornerstone for the new digital economy that's coming. Because we are so effective at analyzing the environment, you need less capital infrastructure in the marketplace to do what companies are doing today. So we actually do reduce overall infrastructure deployment. And we believe that technology like ours should be embedded in chipsets and then ultimately into your phone. And so every phone will be a sensor. Every phone will create a highly organized RF environment, set of data that will be processed using machine learning and AI to be much more effective than even what we're talking about today with what we do through allocation through the RAN. There are tremendous defense applications in what I'm talking about. So when we look at governments today, let's talk about the US government. We have air, space, ground, and so the Navy, but they've also moved into the spectrum as a weapon, right? So spectrum is kind of like the 5th domain for the military now. And I get a lot of questions about what do you mean by spectrum as a weapon, right? And so being able to confuse your adversary on the location of where communications are coming from or an asset that's emitting a signal is a very big part of what the military is focused on right now. So when I summarize what makes our technology unique, persistent at the edge, automated spectrum analysis in real time, and automating that so that you eliminate human intervention. When we first started doing this, we worked with AT&T and looked at their 15 top sites around the country where they could not figure out what was causing the interference. And they had been at it for months, using outside firms, different technology. On average, we solved the problem in less than 3 hours per site. Okay, now we did that by broad-based scanning, by doing a lot of what we were saying with AI to analyze the patterns in a particular market that you could associate what was causing interference, because interference is intermittent. It's not always there. And so what we did is create models to help understand what was causing some of this interference.
How do you price it?
So here's the beauty. So we did this for free for them because we were shooting for a very large, U.S. national contract. And at the end of the day, we cut it off at 15. And I said, no more freebies because, we've proven to you that we can do this. Now let's talk about putting this out across the board to your company. And they came back with, well, we just spent $15 million on PR100s. I can't buy this now. It'll make me look bad and I'll lose my job. Because I was the one that signed the $15 million contract for the PR100s. And so this is what the guy was telling me. And so we had a struggle with AT&T because they couldn't get around the internal politics on rolling out technology that was something that they hadn't created internally. And so we moved away from AT&T and started focusing more on both government and critical asset protection opportunities in the near term. And so we kind of put the big telcos on the back burner from a strategy standpoint as a result of that experience. And that taught us a valuable lesson that even if you have the best technology, there's an inherent inertia in the market that you have to get past, right? And that's, I'm sure you guys have all experienced that as well. The important aspect too of what we built was that we wanted to make sure that our software was scalable, that it was easily integrated into existing infrastructure. And we wanted to make sure, as I mentioned before, that we had a solid patent portfolio around the technology that we had built. And then that was enhanced by deep learning engines and AI and so forth. And we were able to do that And it took us about 10 years to really fully build this, but we were able to accomplish it. Our focus today is also very much on how to drive solutions into the government market. Now that we've got credibility on the commercial side with how the technology is being deployed and how it functions and what its value proposition is, we have focused very much on larger government contracts, focusing mainly on the DoD as well as some three-letter agencies and how they would use the technology. I guess fitting with the theme of this conference, we really do believe that innovators are going to prevail in the upcoming wireless generation. I mentioned all of the things that are coming with 5G and 6G and how important it is to try to find a niche within that sector where you can try to drive value. Currently, spectrum sharing is not something the carriers were really focused on because it wasn't the shark closest to the boat for them. They were really focusing on spectrum slicing and some other things they could do to kind of delay the need for that. But now it's coming, and it's coming very fast. So you'll see a big focus on spectrum sharing globally this year in 24. And that will affect the RAN vendors. That will affect how both RAN and virtual RAN and the move to virtual RAN, because a lot of what's happening today is going to shift to the cloud. A lot of the function of the RAN is going to shift into the cloud and can be effectively leveraged that way. But technology and innovation is going to continue to be critical. I mentioned earlier, we've developed 160 patents. We've got 31 pending. We hope to be at 200 issued patents by the end of Q1 this year. But one of the things that we think is really important to share with this group is that having a process for your patent application and a strategy on how you build your patent portfolio is critical. So because you're in a world now where it's the first to file, not first to invent, right? So having a first to file strategy, building on continuation so you can leverage the earlier filing dates to protect your technology is a critical strategy that needs to be followed. Having a process where you really do a lot of research on prior art to sustain the speed of your patent application being awarded, testing and providing data to the examiner that shows that the patent works, that the technology is functional. We put a package together that's enabled us to basically have our patents issued at 2 times the industry average speed-wise, faster than everybody else, including the big boys. That's critical when you're a young company and you're trying to show value with your portfolio, that you're getting patents very quickly. And if you're in a unique area where you're driving technology and you're breaking some barriers so you don't have a lot of competition, that also helps with the speed of patent applications and award.
Do you trade patents? Make money out of patents?
We have not licensed our patent technology yet. That is a big part of our revenue model coming forward. In fact, we see space. I get this question all the time. Like, you have ground sensor data. That's how your company's built, is getting information from sensors on the ground, whether it's the RAN infrastructure, existing infrastructure, your own technology. Do you see space as a threat to that? Because there are companies that use satellites to gather information, et cetera. And we actually don't see that as a threat. We see it as a potential advantage. We've created a patent strategy on using spatial data from low Earth orbit satellites, suborbital companies that are clearly have a role to play. But if they're going to play in data communications other than broadcast, we will own patents in that space on how to integrate that with ground sensor data to be effective. Because in order to have low latency and high reliability and spectrum sharing, the speed that's required, you're going to need to marry that data with ground sensor data to be effective. And we will own the licenses for that process. And so we're always looking for how can we develop future licensed technology from our patents, even though we've yet to actually monetize it. We're in the process of flipping that switch right now. We actually lead in this space around spectrum optimization. Every country in the world, every company in the world, except for Qualcomm, from a total number perspective. But in the critical areas of RF capture, RF analysis, developing actionable data and overall process optimization, we lead every company in the world today with respect to patents in that space. And we view those as 4 critical elements, of the overall wheel in this particular space. When you look at the companies that are citing us, as well as the companies that we're citing, because we build on others' technology. So we analyze patents that are out there, and then we build on top of those patents. And then when you look at the companies that are citing us, these are all very relevant marquee brands that shows that we've got a very strong position in this particular space. So we built our strategy.
Are there brands that you would have liked listed there that you don't have yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so if you look at right now, because the next question I get is, what are you guys asking for? What are you doing? Or how can you invest in your particular company? For the first time in 11 years, I can tell you we're not really looking for money anymore. We've been looking for money since day one, but not right now. We're in the process of positioning the company for sale.
Even for your wife's shopping?
Yes, thanks. Thanks to Julie. So we're in the process of working with Barclays to position the company for sale today. We expect to have a sale this year. And the reason that we're doing it now, even though we've just flipped the switch from R&D to commercial, is that the technology that we have, we believe, is really critical for this perfect storm that's coming with 5G and spectrum sharing, et cetera. And so, we're working with firms today, potential acquirers, Google, Microsoft, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, Dell, T-Mobile are all interested in DGS. And so from those 6, we think we will end up with somebody by this summer that will be very impactful for us. I'm hoping it's going to be Google because we think we're the best fit for them. And so Google is on here, and I'd like to see them a little bit more. But we're also creating, which is a typical best practice, some real competition between Google and Microsoft, right? And so, that's to me, we do have Microsoft on here. So if there's one company that I would say I would like to see here more, probably Google. But the fact that you can create some synergies between, I'll just call competitive tension between Google and Microsoft, between Qualcomm and NVIDIA, between T-Mobile and others, is really what we're trying to do this year. And so we're focusing on the hyperscalers, we're focusing on the RAN companies, when we're focusing on the carriers as well as our market. We're not really looking at defense companies because my experience, having been in M&A for most of my career, is that they're looking for companies that are accretive to earnings. They don't treat startups well. You're not going to get the value from a Lockheed Martin or an LG, an L3 Harris that you would from a Google or Microsoft. And so we're kind of putting them to the side. Yet you can see Raytheon and others are citing our portfolio as they continue to focus on, what they're doing. So that kind of brings me to conclusion on what I wanted to chat with you guys about today. I'm here all week and happy to answer any questions. I did offer to share some experiences. We've been successful in raising $100 million in capital for DGS over the last 10 years, mostly through my private network, no VCs, no PE money, which is not normal. And so, especially for a company with 0 revenue. So happy to share some of the best practices. I was talking to Martin about some of that last night. Happy to discuss that with you guys if you're interested this week as well.
What was the highest valuation?
The last raise that we did, the pre-money valuation of the company was $450 million. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Let's stay here though, and in terms of questions, then we're going to take a break in just a moment, have some coffee, and then we'll come back. But questions for Fernando on digital global systems. First of all, how many of you were already, before you heard his presentation, you were aware of the fact that Spectrum is moving into how would you say it? Into a sharing?
Yeah, a sharing.
Model, an industry model? Yeah?
Yeah, that's fair.
I knew Daniel would, okay. Anybody else that was aware? Yeah? Edward and so forth. And what was the number one thing that Fernando mentioned, which is the most surprising from his presentation?
But the regulator doesn't step in, doesn't want to control it.
Yeah, so that's an interesting comment, right? And so in the U.S. market, the regulator is taking a cue from the DoD and the government that owns the spectrum. And so the NTIA, the FCC are really following recommendations from what the DoD wants to do and how they want to repurpose that spectrum. Yeah. So it goes, Department of Commerce makes the recommendation first. It's approved by the president, which is kind of a rubber stamp, especially right now. And then you get a series of additional pushback and hearings after the conferences take place. But I'm surprised the regulators have not taken a more active role in the U.S. as well. It's interesting. Not yet. Yeah.
You know, most business models have moved to a kind of network orientation, right? Yeah, just in general, that's kind of almost the definition of what's going on right now in the platform ecosystem world. So is part of the sharing model is that it's the idea of shared infrastructure, which is similar in other industry models. I mean, there's obviously a lot of difference too, but is it just that, was that part of the insight that we're sharing everything, so therefore we will share also this finite resource?
Yeah, no, I think there's two things that are driving the shift towards spectrum sharing, and it's mostly the balance I mentioned earlier between the need for the government to secure its borders and have national security around balancing national security with commercial economic deployment. And those two things, which they're responsible for driving, and the balance between those two things is, I think, what's driving the need for sharing more than anything else. And I think what you're going to see is when they start rolling out dynamic spectrum sharing solutions, you're going to see more shared services around existing infrastructure being shared. Because one of the things that I think I said I was going to talk about this and then I didn't. The reason the carriers are really against spectrum sharing is because they're losing control, right? And so if you have a hyperscaler like Google that can roll out a new service by asking the government for spectrum in a particular market, they're bypassing the carrier pipe. They're bypassing all of that. They don't need that anymore. But there is going to be an element of infrastructure that is needed to drive this nationally. And so whether it's the tower companies, whether it's the carriers, a combination of, I think you're going to see mandated sharing of infrastructure and leveraging that for spectrum sharing to really be deployed aggressively. Right?
Is it true? I mean, I always heard that one of the things that Steve Jobs and Apple did really, really right was not allow the carriers to dictate.
Yeah.
He basically had that, kind of Mexican standoff and said, we will not allow this. And as a result, created the App Store and all of the, the infrastructure, which allowed it to become almost $1 trillion company and so forth. So, I understood that maybe you can tell me whether I'm right, is that because there was a moment that Nokia and Symbian and so forth looked very, very promising, but they did not have that same control over. There's a completely different relationship with the carriers, which did not enable it to become what Apple then became.
Yeah, and so Nokia, Ericsson, they have a monopoly on the radios, but one of the things that's pushing them is the whole the O-RAN initiative, which has created an open architecture for RAN, which if they're not participating now, they will, because the O-RAN architecture initiative is going to force additional functionality into the RAN, into the marketplace. Yeah. And if they don't compete with that, they'll be left behind. And so you have firms like Microsoft and Google that are aggressively looking at ways to bypass carriers for the new services. And technology like what we're talking about here and what we have enables that. When you combine that with dynamic spectrum sharing and you team up with infrastructure providers that have tower assets, because most of the carriers don't own their own towers anymore, right? They lease it, to Crown Castle and American Tower and a number of other global tower companies. And so those infrastructure providers, coupled with the concept of dynamic spectrum sharing, coupled with hyperscalers putting new apps into the market, could create a very different dynamic that bypasses the carriers, and they don't like that. right? And they just don't like that.
You've got a question here, Edward. Edward Rodriguez?
I wanted to ask, you mentioned that you guys were working on trials with some of the telecom carriers. Were you working with just one, or you work with multiple carriers?
Yeah. So great question. And so our focus today has been mostly with T-Mobile, as opposed to all. When we look at the tower companies, we're looking at a neutral host type environment with respect to the deployment of our technology on a tower asset. So in theory, it would be applicable to all the carriers that are on that particular tower. But as far as showing how we're using the technology today, comparing it, there are a number of carriers that believe that they can use crowdsourced data to accomplish similar things. We've written white papers on how crowdsourced data is not sufficient for what we're talking about. And we've just found that T-Mobile has been, I don't want to say the smartest, T-Mobile has been the most aggressive and open-minded around some of the things that we're proposing. So we're really have just gained more traction with them.
So you think that the others will be playing catch up?
Yes. Yes. And they all will at some point be forced to do this because the differences will be so significant that you can't ignore it, right? Yeah. Did you have a question? No.
Any other questions? Okay, we're gonna thank you very much, Fernando.
Thank
That
you,
was
guys.
absolutely outstanding.
Thank you. Thank you.